So here's a question for you. If you encountered God right now, today, standing right there in front of you,
Hmm.
would you actually be able to identify that being as God based on what you already know? I mean, could you verify ontologically that the being before you matched your definition?
That is the ultimate test, isn't it? And based on the pretty rigorous philosophical source material we've been digging into for this deep dive, the answer is a profound and frankly a pretty unsettling no.
Welcome to the deep dive.
Mhm.
Our source material today isn't really interested in debating whether God exists. It takes a different, much sharper path.
A very different path.
It argues that while God is, entirely definable and believable, God is fundamentally not identifiable based on our current intellectual framework.
And our mission today is to really unpack that core distinction the source material makes. It's
Mhm.
all about the difference between defining the essence of God, which is what necessity demands, and establishing the identity of God, which is what specificity provides. This is a deep dive into knowledge, really. Epistemology, not theology.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're going to show you why all those traditional philosophical proofs that establish the need for God, what we call necessity, why they completely fail to provide the ontological identity you need for actual recognition.
Yeah.
So get ready to grapple with concepts like uh, a priori versus posteriori necessity, Kripke's view on specificity, and this really crucial philosophical difference between believing about God, which is didicto belief.
And believing in a specific knowable God, which is de-re belief.
Right.
And the stakes here are, well, they're crucial for understanding belief itself. I mean, if we accept the foundational argument laid out by thinkers like Saul Kripke, then everything that exists, it exists with a rigid identity or specificity. So if God exists,
I must have one.
God must have one. The question isn't whether God has an identity, but why we, the believer, are apparently completely unaware of what that specific identity might be.
Okay, let's unpack that core tension. The paper starts with this huge, head-turning claim that what we agree upon regarding the essence of God, it doesn't provide any specificity for the identification of God.
Right. We know the definition, but we don't know the unique, rigid identifying features.
And this is where we have to introduce those philosophical tools you mentioned, specifically the distinction between didicto and de-re belief.
Let's break that down because it's like the intellectual engine of this entire argument.
It really is. So when we talk about a didicto belief, we mean a belief about a proposition. For instance, the statement, a necessary being exists. You believe that statement is true. It's knowledge of a concept.
But a de-re belief is different. It's a belief in a particular thing. You're relating a property directly to an individual object or person. So that being standing right there is the necessary being. You're pointing, so to speak.
The source material uses a classic philosophical puzzle, the Electra paradox, to illustrate this exact gap. Electra held the true didicto belief that Orestes was her brother.
She knew that as a fact, as a proposition.
Absolutely. But when the man who was Orestes stood right in front of her, she didn't possess the specific de-re knowledge required to recognize him as her brother. The conceptual knowledge just didn't translate into specific identification.
And this is exactly the God paradox. We can know that a necessary being exists. That's didicto necessity. We can accept the proposition that there must be an uncaused cause to avoid, infinite regress.
But the conceptual knowledge doesn't automatically mean we know who that being is.
Not at all. Or how to identify that particular being if we were to encounter it. That's the de-re identity we're missing.
So we've established a knowledge gap.
Yeah.
And this is where Kripke's law of specificity comes in, which the paper just adopts fully. If we can't establish the is of specificity, the unique identifiable qualities, then we can't establish the is of identity.
Right, and what does specificity demand in this context? It demands empirical, rigid identifiers. I mean, think about it this way. The paper compares God to gold. Gold is definable. We know its essential characteristics. It's heavy, it's malleable, it has a certain color. In the same way, God is definable, omniscient, omnipotent, necessary.
But I'm guessing that analogy breaks down pretty quickly when we get to identification.
Precisely. Because gold is also identifiable. We have a posteriori information. Its specific atomic number is 79. That specificity lets us identify gold anywhere in the world.
That's the rigid identifier.
That's it. But for the necessary being, for God, we lack that kind of, that rigid a posteriori identifying data. We have the definition, but not the specific, unique identity marker.
So the crux is, if we lack the information to establish an ontological identity, then the whole search for empirical proof of God's existence becomes, well, meaningless.
It's a bit of a dead end. If you can't say who you're proving exists, the proof itself just lacks foundation.
The true philosophical pivot, then, has to be extrapolating the relevance of God from the relevance of the questions themselves, the questions that necessitated the belief in the first place.
Which leads us directly to the core failure the source material finds in all those traditional philosophical arguments.
Right. And here's where we challenge some real giants of philosophy. For centuries, thinkers have argued for God based on necessity, causal, logical, metaphysical. But our source material says these only establish the need for God.
Not the identity of God, and that distinction is just so crucial.
Why? Why is it so critical?
Because necessity only gives you an abstract requirement. I mean, take Leibniz's famous quote, why is there something rather than nothing? To avoid an infinite regress of causes, logic demands an uncaused cause. That right there, that's necessity.
That's a priori knowledge gained independently of experience.
Exactly. A priori and analyticity, they can establish the requirement for this being. We're forced to posit its existence to make sense of the world.
But what happens when we look at the historical arguments? You mentioned Descartes' logical necessity or Swinburne's factual necessity, or even Plantinga's really nuanced metaphysical necessity.
Well, they are all arguments for ontological necessity. They prove that the existence of a necessary being is coherent or even required, but they offer zero identifying features for the being itself.
So they establish a job title, not a biography.
That's a great way to put it. They tell us what role God must play in the universe, but not who is playing that role.
Which brings us back to Kripke and that distinction between the two types of necessity.
Yes, and this is the key insight we have to fully grasp. First, you have a priori necessity, which is known through reason or definition alone. The classic example is all bachelors are unmarried men. It's logically true in all possible worlds.
That's conceptual necessity.
Right. But Kripke expanded this with a posteriori necessity. This is necessity you establish after an empirical discovery. And once that fact is established, Kripke argued, it becomes metaphysically necessary, true in all possible worlds, even though you needed experience to discover it.
The water analogy is perfect here.
It's indispensable. For centuries, people knew water sustained life. That was a kind of a priori understanding of water's essence. It was necessary for survival, but only when science established the a posteriori identity.
That water is H2O.
That water is H2O. Only then did we gain the identification. And once we established that specific identity, we can make the huge metaphysical claim that in every possible world, the substance we call water must be H2O.
So if we translate that to God, we know the a priori essence, the necessary being, the uncaused cause. But we lack the H2O level identification. We're missing that specific, rigid ontological marker.
And without that, we're left with a concept, not a recognized entity. We have the role, but the performer is totally undefined.
So if necessity fails to give us identity, let's pivot. Let's look at the attributes we commonly associate with God's essence. The paper argues that even these fall short. Let's take two big ones, immortal God and creator God.
Okay, starting with immortal God. This attribute just means birthless and deathless. A non-contingent existence. This is so central that the philosopher Epicurus argued it was the only attribute that should be associated with a deity.
Right. Immortality is definable. We can all grasp the concept of something that never began and never ends. So why does the source claim this fails as an identifier?
It fails because it's not specific enough. Immortality only posits the need for a necessary being to avoid that regression. It doesn't give you an observable or unique basis for identification. And critically, it doesn't establish the claim of monotheism.
How so?
Well, even if we establish an identity for one immortal God, that identity can't preclude the possibility of other, separate, equally immortal beings existing at the same time. Identification has to be unique.
That's a powerful point. The necessity argument on its own might only establish polytheism, not monotheism. Okay, what about the second attribute? Creator God. This is huge for many believers. The universe exists, so something must have caused it.
Sure, we have to accept the need for a universe maker. But here's the philosophical trap the source identifies. Being a creator is an incidental feature of the being. It's not the identity of the being.
Whoa, okay. That's a massive claim. What do you mean by incidental?
Think of it this way. If I say, my friend is a baker, the act of baking is incidental to my friend's identity. My friend is still my friend whether they are baking, sleeping, or have retired from baking altogether.
Ah, okay. So if God is God because of creation, then you have to ask the really challenging question. What was God before creation?
Exactly. If God was God before creation and not because of creation, then creation cannot be the defining basis for God's specific identity. Identification has to be inherent and rigid, independent of the actions the being happens to perform.
Only what identifies God as God can make God as God.
Right. So the creator attribute is essential for our understanding of the universe, but it's pretty useless for the identification of the creator.
So this inability to identify God, even through these essential attributes, it forces us to look beyond just logic and reason. What about revelation? For billions of people, sacred texts are the source of knowledge about God. Do they provide those tangible identifying marks we're looking for?
And according to the source, the answer is still no. When you examine the sacred texts, the Abrahamic traditions, others too, they powerfully establish the need for God, the essence of God, the relationship God seeks. But they do not reveal any tangible ontological identity.
They give you titles and characteristics, but no H2O equivalent.
No H2O equivalent.
This touches on that theological concept from John Calvin, the sensus divinitatis, this idea that humans are created with an innate awareness of God. If that's true, why isn't everyone automatically able to identify God if they see God?
And the paper concludes that while the awareness of God may be innate, acknowledging God is a choice, which leads to a really fascinating hypothesis, that perhaps God's identity is intentionally not revealed to us.
Okay, why would the necessary being actively withhold the very means of its own identification?
It's all about preserving free will and the nature of belief itself. I mean, if identity were clearly revealed, if we had the H2O formula for God, then belief upon encounter would be compulsory.
It wouldn't be faith anymore. It would just be factual observation.
It would be fact. Since identity is not revealed, belief has to be what the source calls a belief decision. It's a non-compulsory choice for or against the concept of the necessary being, regardless of whether that being, shows up.
So the lack of identification actually preserves the integrity of the choice. That feels like a common ground, something that allows for a relationship even without that kind of identification.
It is. The paper points out that while identity is missing, consciousness is considered common between God and humans. And this shared consciousness allows us to acknowledge who each is to the other. God as the birthless, deathless being, and humans as conscious beings who will cease to exist without requiring specific, rigid markers.
And this brings us straight to Martin Buber's philosophy of relationship, the whole I-thou idea.
Exactly. Buber argued that God's need for us is just as great as our need for God. Without the believer, we can't have the conceptual entity we call God, because God is, at its core, a title given by the believer to the necessary being.
And that acknowledgement, that relationship, it can happen completely independent of any physical or ontological identification.
That's the argument.
This has been a really comprehensive deep dive. Let's try to summarize the 3 core takeaways for everyone listening.
Okay, first, necessity arguments, whether they're based on causality, a priori, or pure logic, can only posit the ontological need for God. They establish the essence and the role.
Second, without that a posteriori specificity, without Kripke's H2O equivalent, we fundamentally lack the ontological identity of God. And therefore, God is definable and believable, but not identifiable.
And third, the true significance of what we know about God rests not on establishing some empirical proof of existence, but on the enduring relevance of the questions that necessitate belief in the first place. That pursuit of understanding why there is anything at all.
Which leads us back to our starting point. But it shifts the focus from knowledge to intention. If belief is a necessary choice and an acknowledgement independent of confirmation, and if identity is withheld precisely to preserve the integrity of that belief decision, this raises a pretty important question for you, the listener. Does the act of constantly seeking identification fundamentally misunderstand the type of relationship God might be seeking with humanity?
And think about what your own belief decision is anchored to. Is it anchored to the essential characteristics you get from reason, that abstract idea of necessity? Or are you still searching for the specific identity you hope to one day encounter? The answer to that really defines the entire nature of your belief.